Hey everybody, you're watching ASMR Angel Reads. We're continuing with chapter 5 of Daggerspell. The last part we read, Jill was helping the caravan merchant sell items to the West folk, and then when they were done trading, one of the West folk named Genitar is going back to people lands with them, and the Dwemer Master Adern is going with them so they can capture a rogue Westfolk, Lane, I think his name was. Um, but Adern was Nevin's apprentice back in the second past life, so he's still alive after a few hundred years as well. So now we'll carry on with the last section 1 of chapter 5. Getting the caravan on the road seemed to take an eternity. Cullen kept on the move, yelling orders as the men got the mules loaded and themselves mounted on the spare horses. During the march, he rode up and down the line, yelling and bullying everyone to ride as fast as they could, occasionally slapping the rump of a bulky mule with the flat of his sword to keep it trotting. At last they came to a ruined dun rising from the wild grass with all the loneliness of a cairn making the warrior's grave. Oh, that's right. There's bandits that are after them. Adern sends the bandits after them, so they're going to an abandoned castle to take refuge from the bandits. Although the stone walls and the brock itself looked sound, the wooden gates and the outbuildings had long since rotted away. Weeds and ivy ran riot in the ward. Cullen herded the caravan inside. Get the mules and the horses inside the brock. Feed them to keep them calm. When he saw his orders being followed, he ran around to the back of the ward and found the well. As he expected, it had fallen in and was choked with rubble as well as ivy. He ran back to the brock and detailed 3 muleteers to rush to the nearby stream and fill every pot and water skin they had. Off to one side he saw Adern testing the rusty spiral staircase that led up to the second floor. It should hold my weight, Adern announced. I wouldn't let a man of your size try it. I doubt me if the floor above will hold anyone. Cullen glanced up at the rotten timbers. I have to try. I need a high place that's also private. I can't be scaring the men out of their wits with Dwemer. Cullen felt a bit queasy himself. Jill said Laudelane's a lord's counselor, Adern went on. Could he be persuaded his lord to send men to murder us? It depends on how much this Corbin honors him, I suppose, but it's hard to believe. Do you think Laudelane's trying to stop you from hauling him in for that murder? That was my first thought, but it doesn't make sense. Yet I've never seen a bandit out here, and I tell you, the men I saw were cursed well armed. Well, I'll have another look. I need my glasses. I can't see. As nimble as a squirrel, Adern scrambled up the creaky stairs. Cullen hurried outside and saw the West folk down by the gate. They were unpacking gear from the travois, among it a pair of longbows, beautifully polished staffs of some dark wood he'd never seen before, and as tall as they were. Archers, are you? We are, Genitar said. I think our bandits are in for a little surprise. He gestured to Albarel, who was unpacking a sword belt. He's not Cullen of Caremore, but we fight with long knives in our hand too. Well and good then, maybe we'll take some of these bandits to the other lands with us. Albarel, do you have any armor? Elded mail, though it might come in handy, so I packed it. And here I thought you were a fool, Calendril said, for dragging all that weight along. Albarel smiled with a tight twist to his mouth. Colin noticed that Albarel had a scar down his cheek much like the one he himself carried. So your people fight among themselves, do they? Every now and then, but the elded lord marked me like this. I killed the bastard for it long time ago now. The four of them peered up at the rotted splinters along the top of the wall that were all that was left of the catwalks under the ramparts. Never would they hold an archer again. Well, the top of that wall's about 5 feet thick, Genitar said at last. We can stand there and shoot if we're careful. Those projection things will provide some cover for our legs anyway. Marylands, with a real surprise, Colin realized that they knew nothing about duns. They're called Marylands, but we still have to get up there. Albarel took a rope off the travelway, turned it into a lasso, then stepped back and cast. The loop sailed up and encircled the Maryland as easy as if he'd been aiming at a horse in a herd. Colin whistled in admiration. Now we can weave ourselves a ladder, Calendril said. I wonder if those bandits are still lying in their stinking ambush. May the flies cluster thick around them if they are. Adern will know, Genitar remarked. Look, he's just going to find out. Just then Colin heard a strange sound above him, a rushy flap like wings of an enormous bird. When he glanced up, an enormous bird was exactly what he saw. A great silver owl, a good 5 feet long, flapping up from the brock, circling once, then heading off to the east with a long, mournful cry. Albarel waved farewell to it as casually as if he were waving to some friend who was riding off to a tavern. For a moment, Colin came close to vomiting. By the black ass of the lords of hell, can Adern turn himself into an owl? Of course, Genitar said. You just saw him, didn't you? Colin's mind refused to acknowledge the fact. He had, of course, seen the owl. He believed that Genitar was telling the truth. He even remembered seeing Adern go upstairs for some purpose of his own, but his mind stubbornly refused to draw the proper conclusion. He stared at the sky for a long time before he could speak. Well and good then, Albarel. We'd best get our blasted mail on our backs. Every morning, unless it was pouring rain, Rodri led his warband out to exercise the horses. Lately, thanks to the threat of the rebellion, he'd been making the rides a good long ones to ensure that the men and mounts both would be fit to ride to war. Thus it seemed perfectly logical when the idea occurred to him of taking the men out for a day-long jaunt. He was talking with Canarid, his captain, as he usually did after breakfast, when suddenly, out of nowhere, as he would later realize, it occurred to him that none of them had spent a full day in mail in months. Have the men pack provisions for the noon meal. We'll ride fully armed, rest a bit, then return. Well and good, my lord. Which way shall we ride? Oh, doesn't much matter. Rodri named the first direction that came to his mind. West. Although a dark line of fog crouched ominously on the ocean horizon, it was a fine sunny morning when they set out. Every now and then Rodri would turn in the saddle just to look at his men riding two abreast with red lion shield of his adopted clan at every saddle peak. Soon he would be leading a full army. Cadverdock, he thought to himself, is a fine ring to it, truly. Eventually he called Canrid up to ride beside him. The captain was a solid man in his late 20s with blonde hair and drooping mustache almost as thick as Sliggin's. Since he'd served the Ku Klux all his life, Roderick could speak freely with him. Are the men talking of Dwemer among themselves? They are, my lord. I do my best to stop it. I knew I could count on you for that. How do you feel about these rumors yourself? Pile of horse shit, my lord. Good, I couldn't agree more. At noon they stopped to rest in a meadow about half a mile inland where the river wound down from the north. Just like one of his men, Rodri unsaddled his own horse and let it roll. Then he tethered it out. He sat on the grass with his men too. He knew that they saw him as an interloper, and he was determined to show them that the sudden elevation of his prospects in life hadn't swelled his head. They were all trading friendly jests over their bread and smoked meat when Rodri felt as much as heard hoofbeats coming their way. He scrambled up, looked off to the north. Trotting fast beside the river came a rider leading a spare horse. Who by the gods would be out here? Cannerig joined him and shaded his eyes to stare at the tiny figures. Old Nevin the herb man, maybe, Cannerig said. It's not, because those are two western hunters, not a palfrey and a mule. By the hells, his lordship has cursed good eyes. So I do. Rodri saw a wink of silver in the rider's belt. A silver dagger with two western hunters. What do we have here, a horse thief? No horse thief, however, would have broken into a gallop and ridden straight for them as the silver dagger did. He was a young man, blond and rode filthy, and riding without a shield, though he had a sword at his side. He swung himself down from his horse and ran to kneel at Rodri's feet. Down one side of his face was a livid purple bruise. My lord, his soft, unchanged voice made it likely he was about 14. Do you serve the Tyrian in Canobane? I do, and I'm her son to boot, Lord Rodri Mailweed. A Mailweed, thanks to every god. Then I know I can trust your honor, my lord. I've just come from a merchant caravan to beg for help. It's bandits, my lord, at least 30 of them, and they've got us pinned up in a ruined dun up north. Bandits? In my demesne? I'll have their heads on pikes. Rodri spun around to yell orders. Saddle up and get ready to ride. Amber, ride back to the dun and give her grace the news. Tell her to send a cart with supplies and the surgeon after us. Everyone ran to do his bidding. Get up, Silver Dagger, Rodri went on. What were you, a hired guard? Well, my father is, to tell you the truth. I just travel with him. Well, mount up and get ready to lead us back. What a splendid bit of luck this is, me having the warband out here. You'd think it was Dwemer or such like. The lad giggled in an outburst of hysteria, then ran back to his horse. As the hot afternoon dragged on, there was no sign of Adern. While the others rested inside the broch, Colin and Genitar kept an uneasy watch. Colin at the gates, Genitar pacing back and forth along the top of the wall. Colin began to wonder if they'd ever see the old man again, or if he'd been captured by the enemy. Finally, when the sun lay low in the sky, Genitar called out in triumph, Here he comes! Although Colin strained his eyes, it was several minutes more before he saw the flapping speck in the sky that meant the owl. All over again, Colin felt sick with unnatural size of the thing as the bird swept down and disappeared into the upper window of the broch. It was some minutes later before Adern ran out, pulling his tunic over his head. They're on their way, but so is help. Lord Rodri and his warband are heading up from the south. What did Jill do? Colin said. Found her both those horses? She didn't. She met Rodri on the road. Adern looked briefly troubled. Something stranger than strange is afoot here, Genitar. Did you see any hawks flying overhead? One or two, Genitar called down. Oh, ye gods, you don't think... I do. Laudelin has to be behind this. Adern turned to Colin. The men I saw were well armed, well provisioned, and they carried shields and a number of different blazons. Then they're not bandits, sure enough. What's Laudelin trying to do? Kill the witnesses to his murder before they can reach the court? So I thought at first, but here I'm the chief witness against him, and it's hard to trap a man who can fly away. The old man allowed himself the ghost of a smile. The rest of the men were already running out of the broch. Hurriedly, Colin disposed the pitiful force he had on hand. 2 decent swordsmen, counting himself, 3 men skilled with a quarterstaff, and 5 who knew the right way to hold the staff a little more. Because of the rubble, the gate was only big enough for 2 men to fight side by side. He and Aberrel would have to hold it as long as they could, with Dragon and the other skilled staffmen right behind to step in when they fell. Up on the wall, the archers stood ready with full quivers at their hips. Adern climbed up to join them. Now listen, lads, Colin said. No heroics like in the bard songs. Just fight to hold your place. It was some time before Colin saw the pack of 34 men in the mail ride out of the east at a steady trot. About 300 yards away, they drew up and clustered around a leader for hasty conference, then came on again at a walk. Colin could see men loosening shields and getting ready to dismount for the final charge on the gates. But like most Elded men, they were going to stay in the saddle for as long as possible, a habit that was to prove fatal. At 100 yards, they pulled up, well out of javelin range. Arrows sang out from the wall. Then again and again, the lead horses reared, screaming in agony, and went down hard, rolling on their riders as arrows came again and again and again. Horses behind them bucked and kicked in panic. Men yelled and swore. The arrows flew again, a noiseless rain of death. The warband broke into a riot of men on foot and panicked horses, and still the arrows flew down. Shouting and screaming, the warband turned tail and fled, leaving behind 12 dead men and more horses. Far down the meadow they regrouped. When the muleteers broke into howls of laughter, Colin turned and yelled them into silence. It isn't over yet, Colin said. We don't have all the arrows in the world with us, and if even 10 of those bastards reach the gate, you'll need your wits about you if you dogs even have any. Then came more waiting while the sun inched itself another notch lower in the sky. Their enemies argued, and somewhere, or so Colin devoutly hoped, Lord Rodri and his men were riding nearer. Finally, Colin saw the enemy dismounting. They spread out into 2 squads, each circling out of bow-shot range around a different side of the dun, then splitting up again. Genitar muttered something in his own tongue that had to be a vile oath from his tone. They've learned somewhat, Albarel remarked. So they have, Colin said. The only thing they can do, rush us from all sides and circle under the shelter of the walls. We can't stop them with only 2 archers. They exchanged a grim smile. At the moment, Colin wondered how he could have hated the Westfolk. He and Albera understood each other perfectly well. Most of the enemy were moving around to the back of the dun. Genitar began sliding along the wall to meet them, but Calandrel held his post over the gates until the other squad began moving to the side. Cursing under his breath, Calandrel moved to face them. For a moment, everything was perpetually quiet. Then a silver horn rang out. Distantly from the far side of the Brock, war cries exploded as the charge began. Closer and closer, a few screams as arrows hit their mark, then the jingle and clink of men and mail running. The first enemies rounded the wall and raced for the gates. 3, 4, too many to count. They mobbed in, but as the gate was too narrow for mobs, the fight was showing a match as much as it was a sword work. Colin parried more than he swung, using his shield like a bludgeon to shove back the blades that hit it. Screaming war cries, the men at the rear pressed forward and forced their own men at the front off balance. Colin and Albarel swung and parried and swayed back and forth in perfect rhythm with each other. Arrows flew down into the rear of the mob, and Colin saw one shaft split a lad's mail and skewer him like a chicken on a spit. Cursing and yelling, part of the mob tried to peel off and run back around the walls. The rest surged forward. Colin got a kill at last, keeping his arms close to his hide and stabbing rather than slashing. As the corpse fell, it knocked another man off his feet, and the mob swirled in confusion. Over the screaming, Colin heard a silver horn ring out. "Red lions," Calandril yelled. "Canaban," Dregid howled. Trapped between Lord Rodri's charge and the dun, the enemy broke into screaming panic. One clot of men surged blindly forward. Colin and Albarel knocked off balance and swung around toward him. With a shout, Dregid leapt into the line. Out of the corner of his eye, Colin saw the blur of a staff swinging down and the snap of a head as an enemy fell. An enemy slashed at Albarel, but an arrow caught him in the back. With a quick stab and slash, Colin killed the last of them. He threw his shield and grabbed Albarel's arm as he tried to stagger to his feet. Alberel flopped like a rag doll into Cullen's shoulder, and his mouth and nose were running blood. The cat-slit eyes, no longer alien, somehow sought his. I always knew this done would see my death, Alberel said. Never though I'd be defending it. When he coughed, blood bubbled and gouted on his lips. Staggering under his weight, Cullen knelt to lay him back down, but Alberel was dead before they reached the ground, his mouth frozen in a blood-stained smile of his own jest. "Aw, shit," Cullen said. Around him echoed the cheers of muleteers. Cullen closed Alberel's eyes and crossed his arms over his chest, then rose to find himself face to face with Rodri. For a moment they merely looked at each other. Cullen was sure that he knew him. Irrational though it was, he'd never been so sure of anything in his life, that he knew this young lord like a brother. Then the feeling vanished like Dwemer. Rodri lay a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. "Lose a friend?" Rodri said. "I did. Well, it happens." "So it does, Silver Dagger." Cullen nodded and let out his breath in a long sigh, surprised at the truth of it. Alberel had become a friend there in the breach. The other two Westfolk came running. At the sight of Alberel, Genitar burst out keening and flung himself down by the body. But Calandrel merely set his hands on his hips, his whole body as tense as a strung bow. "There's another one," he whispered, "slain by the stinking round ears." Then he looked up and howled out a single word in his own tongue, the meaning plain for any man to hear: "Vengeance." Cullen and Rodri glanced at each other, then walked away to leave the Westfolk to their mourning. Once they were out of earshot, the puzzled lord turned to Cullen. "Westfolk? What are Westfolk doing mixed up in this?" "It's a stinking strange tale all around, my lord. These men weren't bandits either. What would you say if I told you Councillor Laudelane of Dunbrudelin's behind this?" Rodri seemed about to argue, then he glanced down to see the shattered shield of one of the enemies, a green shield with a tan chevron. "By the lords of hell's hairy balls, that's Corbin's blazon, sure enough. Looking for a higher, Silver Dagger? I think me you've already captained the first battle of an open war." Loviane was wondering irritably when Rodri and his warband would return when Amor rode in to deliver Rodri's message. Although she said nothing to Amor, the news troubled her badly. She knew there weren't any bandits in Western Eldad for a simple reason, that there wasn't enough caravan trade to support them. At dinner, she and her two serving women, Danyan and Medalia, sat at the table in a hall eerily silent with the warband gone. Lovian picked at her food, then decided she wasn't in the least hungry. "My lady's sore troubled," Medlian said. "I am. It was stupid of Rodri to ride off into nowhere like that." They nodded their agreement. Dark-haired and delicate, Danyan's blonde and homely Medela were both in their late 30s, noble-born friends rather than servants, who 20 years ago had chosen to take Lovian's service rather than marry the unsuitable men their father had picked for them. Shrewd women both, they were her counselors, and Lovian knew that no matter how much intrigue might range around the powerful court, she could count on both for absolute honesty. "I rather find myself missing Tinger tonight. It's so rare that I do, but as a husband he has his good points. He understood matters of war, truly," Danyan said. "So, Dan, you don't think that these so-called bandits are real bandits?" "I don't. I was wondering if we should send a message to Sligan." "That's a very good idea. We can send one of the stable lads. The young rider who just came back must be dead tired." Lovian was about to call Cardok when she heard the clatter in the ward, men and horses riding in, and servants shouting as they ran to meet them. Half thinking it might be Rodri, Lovian rose from her chair, but it was Sligan who strode into the great hall, and right behind him came Nevin. "Well, fancy that," Lovian said. "My lord, I was just going to send you a message." "No doubt, your grace." Sligan bent his knee in a bob that passed for a kneel. Our good Erdman here's been telling me that Rodri went off like a madman to chase bandits. Bandits? Ha! I just happened to see them on the road, your grace, Nevin said. I was gathering valerian root out in the wilderness. Could have been a cow dung for all I care, Sligan snorted. What counts is that you had the wits to ride straight to me. Your grace, I've had trouble news beyond what our Nevin tells me. Lovian realized that armed men were filling the hall, 20, 30, close to 40, most of Sligan's warband. Dan Yin, send the servant to fetch those men ale, Lovian said. Nevin, come have mead with us. I think me you've earned it. Once they were settled, Sligan told his tale. Not 20 minutes after Nevin came in with his news, a messenger arrived from Lord Edar, whose demesne was in the north close to Corbin's, to announce that Corbin and his allies had mustered their army. Edar himself was sending his wife and children to shelter with her brother in the east, and he and his warband would be joining Sligan in Canabane. He'll arrive in 2 days, the messenger was going to write on to you, but I decided to take the news on myself. I took the liberty of sending it along with the rest of your loyal men, though we didn't have any time to waste. My thanks, Lovian said. I'm afraid I don't have the men to write a message anyway. So Nevin told me, and a grim thing that is, eh? Here, your grace, if an army had turned up at your gate, how long could you and your servants have held the dun Canabane? Long enough for you to relieve us, my lord, but I'm glad I don't have to put in that boast to the test. Just so, Sligan said, and had a thoughtful sip of mead. Well, the rest of your allies should ride in on the morrow. I told them to ride at night if they had to. We'll leave you a good fort guard before we go. Will you ride at north after Corbin? West, my lady. Rodri's out in the wilderness with what, 50 men and whatever excuses for guards that merchant had? Corbin's mustered at least 200 men, and I'll wager he's on his way west right now. Lovian bit her lip to keep from crying out. Don't distress yourself unduly, your grace, Nevin broke in. Later I'll have a few interesting things to tell you. My lord, Adern said, I know you have no reason to believe me, but I swear I'm telling the truth. Rodri felt like grabbing the man by the shoulders and shaking him. For an hour now he listened to so much talk of Dwemer that he felt as if the strange words had stranger tales that were water that would never physically drown him. He turned to Cullen, sitting beside him at the campfire in the ward. In the dancing firelight, the silver dagger's impassive face was unreadable. I'd believe him, my lord, Cullen said. Didn't he tell us about the ambush? For that matter, didn't he tell us that you were on the way? True enough. Well and good then, Adern. If you say that Sligan's coming with an army, then we'll stay here and wait for him. My thanks, my lord. If I might make a suggestion, on the morrow you might want to have some of your men cut down trees to barricade the gaps in the walls. Dragut has some axes left from his trading. Good idea, Rodri said. By the black hairy ass of the Lord of Hell, I feel like such a dolt. His lordship is nothing of the sort, Adern snapped. The trap was very well laid, and you had no way of knowing that Lotta Lane was using Dwemer to put thoughts into your mind. It's just a very good thing that Lotta Lane has no way of knowing about Nevin. Rodri shuddered profoundly. But there's one small thing I don't understand, Adern went on. Why didn't Corbin have his whole army out here to wait for you? Simple, Cullen broke in. If he'd marched west with his full force, every lord in the north would have seen him, and they would have mustered and followed him straight away. But he and his allies could slip a few men out, a couple at a time, no doubt, and then follow with the rest. If his worm-riddled plan had worked, he would have been a full day's march ahead of Rodri's allies. Oh, they'd have caught us on the road, sure enough. They might catch us here instead, Rodri said. Adern, do you know how close Corbin is? I don't, but if his lordship will excuse me, I tend to find out. For a while, Rodri and Cullen sat together in companionable silence and watched the leaping fire. All around them the men slept rolled up in their blankets. For all that Cullen was a dishonored silver dagger, Rodri found his presence comforting. Here at least was a man he could understand. It's a passing strange. I've heard of your glory, of course, and I've always wanted to meet you, but I was thinking it might be under better circumstances than this. Oh, I don't know, my lord. I couldn't think of a better time for you to ride my way. Rodri laughed. True enough. If the caravan hadn't sent messengers to me, I suppose Laudeline would have sent one of his men claiming to be a guard or such like. You just spared him the trouble of sending your lad. My lad? Cullen gave him a grin. Here, my lord, Jill's my daughter. Oh, ye gods, here I rode with her all day, and I never once thought she was a lass. Some time later, Jill came to sit by her father. She'd apparently washed her face and hair in the stream because the dirt was gone, revealing a face that was not only obviously female, but beautiful. Or at least it would be beautiful if it weren't for the black and blue bruise on her face. Where did you get that bruise? Cullen said to her. You gave it to me this morning. Cullen winced. Well, so I did. Forgive me, my sweet. I was half to pieces thinking you'd be slain. Jill turned to Cullen and gave him a smile and turned her beauty as delicate and glowing as that of any court lady. Rodri's heart sank. It was more than unfair of the gods to give a lass like this a father who happened to be the best swordsman in the whole wide kingdom of Devery. Okay, that is it for today. Thanks for listening. Bye.